Well, hello, good morning, everyone. I said good morning. Awesome. My name is Rhett Buttle. I am so privileged to be a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute. I work on our Aspen Partnership for an Inclusive Economy, which is really focused on making the American economy work for workers and households. Today, we're so thrilled to be able to have this conversation. Like many of you, I think we read the news about the statistics about how well our economy is doing, but often when we talk to working families, sometimes it doesn't feel like that's the case. And we're so thrilled to have so many of our amazing business partners on stage and our amazing partner in CNBC here to moderate today's conversation. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn the conversation over to Sharon Epperson.
Good morning. Good morning. It's great to be here, and thank you all for being here for a conversation that touches every American and something that we're all very concerned about and interested in, I'm sure, talking about this disconnect that we're seeing here between what economic data shows and how people are feeling about the economy. The economy is very solid. We know unemployment is very low. We know that we're seeing the stock market at near highs. We know that the economy is doing well with job gains, but then there's what people really think about it. And so here to talk about these issues with their hand on the pulse of what the American consumers and investors are thinking and on the economic data are three wonderful experts. Charlie Scharf is the CEO of Wells Fargo. He has also in the past been the CEO of Bank of New York Mellon and Visa and ran the consumer banking business at JP Morgan Chase. Penny Pennington is the CEO of Edward Jones, and it is such a privilege to talk to you because you have the financial services and advisory services in nearly every county in the U.S., so you certainly have your pulse on what investors are thinking. And of course, we have NBC economic analyst Steve Rattner, and he is the CEO of Willett Advisors, which is the investment arm for former New York Mayor Mike Bloomberg's personal and philanthropic assets. As we're talking about the economy this morning, the first question I have for you, and I'm going to start with you, Steve, is how would you grade the U.S. economy today? And what grade would you give it, and why?
Let me give you a couple of pluses and minuses, and then we can come to a letter grade. Look, on the positive side, we've had extraordinary job creation. We're creating something like 250,000 jobs a month, way beyond what I think any of us thought was possible. Unemployment has been at or below 4% for 30 straight months. The economy has been growing steadily. I think there were 2 quarters that were down a little bit, but basically the economy has been growing steadily since we came out of COVID. Workers' wages are rising about 4.2% a year, something like that. And prices are obviously still going up, but what I don't think, and this gets to the heart of your question, what I don't think people fully appreciate is that wages are going up actually faster than prices at the moment. Roughly 4.2% on wages, 3.5% on the CPI, 2.8% if you look at another index called the PCE, which is what the Fed likes to look at. And so, in fact, they don't feel it, and we're going to obviously get into that, but they are, in fact, a little bit better off than they were a year ago, the famous kind of Ronald Reagan question. Look, on the negative side, you have 2/3 of the people who are going to vote this year have never seen inflation above 4%. And they don't know what inflation is. They think prices should just not go up, they should come back down again. Obviously, we know that that would actually be bad. That would be deflation, that would be a bad thing. But nonetheless, it bothers them. Prices of a lot of things that they buy every day, eggs, which was actually the avian flu, not economic policy, things like that, gasoline and so forth. A big negative is housing. Housing affordability is at the lowest level it's been at in like 40 years because interest rates are high and house prices are both high. And that's a real double whammy for people trying to buy a new house, refinance a house. Insurance has gone up a lot. It's what they call a hard market for various complicated reasons we don't need to get into. So I would grade the economy kind of a B+, that people are better off than they were a year ago. But there are a lot of things to think about and worry about, like housing, for example.
Yeah. Penny, does B+ sound like a fair grade to you? How would you rate the economy? What grade would you give it right now?
Sharon, do you remember when we were in first grade and we were just going to school and we weren't old enough to understand A, B, C, D, E letter grades, so they gave us satisfactory and unsatisfactory?
Yes,
that?
yes, yes.
It's satisfactory. The economy is satisfactory. People are feeling unsatisfied or dissatisfied right now, and we're going to have a good conversation about that vibe. But the economy, I don't need to repeat what Steve just very, very eloquently said. Our economy is normalizing now. Inflation rates are coming down. Are those prices that have gone up over time at the grocery store going to come back down? No, no, we don't believe that they are. Employers are moderating now their search for talented professionals, and those talented professionals' expectations for where they're going to work and how they're going to work are moderating as well. And so, importantly, the labor market is cooling off in some very constructive ways. So we see that kind of normalization as a positive, and fundamentally, businesses are investing, growth is strong, the merits of AI and what that might mean for productivity in many, many businesses will be good for growth and innovation. So we've got a satisfactory economy.
Satisfactory, good, satisfactory, very good. What do you think?
Yeah, I'll answer just in terms of just the economy. Put other things aside for a second. Things are really good. They are. I mean, when you look at from our perspective, consumers are in great shape on average overall. A lot of differences there when you go below that. But on average, the consumer is extremely strong, and on average, businesses are doing extremely strong. We look at credit performance. Consumer credit is kind of returning to normal levels from extremely strong levels. But if we look at where consumer credit is performing today, we'd say we'll take this, all day long. Business credit also performing extremely well, with the exception of some industries that are very specific, things like retailers looking to reorganize because they have too much of a physical footprint or some things like that. When you look at consumer spend, our debit card spend, and our credit card spend is incredibly consistent, almost to the level of, it makes you question whether our data is right. I get this report every week that shows on a year-over-year basis how much consumer spend has grown, broken apart between debit and credit, and it's almost exactly the same week after week. Debit card spend is up 2 to 3% almost every single week. Credit card spend for us is in the low double digits. Part of that is we have some new cards. The industry is in the high single digits, and extremely consistent in terms of what we see. So debt levels are very, very reasonable overall. Credit performance is strong. Spend is strong. And when you look at consumer balances and business balances, they've seemed to levelized at kind of this level after coming down from these pre-pandemic levels, coming down from high pandemic levels, looking much more like pre-pandemic levels. So overall, just the actual performance of what we're seeing is really, really good. Yeah. Now, big differences when you take apart the consumer between those who have more money than those who have less money. Averages are extremely deceiving. We should talk a little bit about that, but just overall, things are really, really quite good.
So overall, many surveys are showing the same thing. Consumer sentiment is strong, spending continues to be strong, and yet there's this vibe, the vibe session that they're calling it, right? So that the idea of the general public being pessimistic about the economy, even though the data is strong. And surveys showing that a majority of Americans believe we are actually in a recession right now. Why is there this belief, Charlie, that there is a recession going on when your personal financial situation may be okay, but you think overall the economy is just not?
Yeah, so first of all, when you look at, I said this before, averages are deceiving. So when you look at the average consumer is performing very, very well. But those that had more money have more money than they ever had, and those that didn't have a lot of money are struggling as much, if not more, than they have struggled. When you think about what they're going through, and Steve referred to this before, is when you look at prices, prices are far higher today than they were. And even though wages have gone up, they're not going up for everyone. And even if wages are going up, a point more than inflation, that doesn't translate to, I'm an individual, I go into a store, and I used to spend $50 to buy something, and now it costs $60 or $70. That's what they still know, that's what they still see, and they still remember what they were paying. And so part of that is people have never, as Steve said, have never been through this kind of inflationary environment to understand how they need to readjust what their expectations are to what the reality of the situation is. Also, when you take a look at just what they're hearing is rates are high. right? This group of people is also, they borrow more than they invest, so higher rates are a problem for them. It's not a benefit for them. And so, their borrowing costs have gone up. And we all know the importance for those that actually own homes of mobility or taking money out of a property which is appreciating in value, and they're not able to do that. And so, and then, this last piece of just the talk track of rates are extremely high, rates are going to come down, rates are high because inflation is high. What they see and what they're feeling is reinforced with this message that, the Fed is not taking action because they're still concerned about things, and that when rates start to come down, that's a signal that things are somewhat different. Mm-hmm. So all these things come together just to make them see and feel that what they experience is very different than those that do have a lot of money. Yeah. And there are a lot more with less money than those with a lot of money.
Right. Penny, is it also that people who may have had a lot of money or had more money than they had expected or than their previous generations, that now the job market is strong, but depending on where you are and what you're doing, you may be doing the work now of a couple people as things have been restructured. You may be in a position that you're looking for work longer than you had perhaps a few years ago. How much is the job market impacting how people are feeling about the economy?
Yeah. Well, what Charlie was getting at is something that we describe as the difference between investor sentiment and consumer sentiment. Investor sentiment, if you are an investor, is very strong right now because your portfolio of investment, whether it be modest or whether it be much larger, your portfolio of investment is doing very well, and there are growth lanes there for higher growth. A year ago, people were hunkered down in cash and CDs. They said, I get 5% and I can sleep at night, quote unquote. I feel really good about this. We've actually moved out of that environment, and investors are looking for those growth lanes. But we're all consumers. And as consumers, depending on what our job prospects are, where we are in the labor force, and importantly for our clients and the conversations that we have with them, where their kids and grandkids are. So we speak with our clients across multiple generations, 8 million clients. Sharon, you said it, we have a client in every county but one in the United States. We have a brick and mortar location in 2/3 of the counties of the US. So we sort of have our hand on the pulse of what's going on with American investors and consumers. And what they're sharing with us is that they are worried about jobs. If you're in a location where manufacturing is moving to other places or has moved to other places, you're worried about that. If you're thinking about artificial intelligence and what that might mean for your job prospects, people are talking about that. And then when you think about education and the impacts of education, the investment that people are making in education, now you're talking about folks who hold the wealth today who are thinking about their kids and grandkids. That's sort of the consumer part of the sentiment, and that's where I think this a big part of this disconnect comes in the 500,000 conversations we have with clients a week. That's where the disconnect is. Gosh, I feel pretty good about my investment portfolio, and what do I need to invest in to find the growth? But gosh, I'm feeling a little pessimistic about my job prospects and that of my kids and my grandkids.
Yeah. This disconnect, Steve, is it different than we've seen before between what the general public thinks about the economy and how well the economy is doing?
Yeah, look, I've been following the economy in my professional life for almost 50 years since I started covering it as a young journalist. And yeah, even in the early 80s, well, look, we've had other periods where consumer sentiment was as bad as it is today, and it is really bad. If you look at just the consumer sentiment surveys, they're down at like 40-year lows. We've never had it in the context of an economy that I think all three of us seem to agree on is actually doing pretty well, pretty well, very well, somewhere in that zip code. And so the obvious question is, why is that? I think we've talked about a couple of the reasons here. I think inflation is definitely probably the single biggest piece of that because of the fact that people haven't experienced it before, because there are items that they buy every day, like gasoline and things like that, where they see the prices and they know, as you said, and they know it's different than it was last time. But you know, but the reality is a little different than what people think. For example, gasoline prices today, if you adjust them for inflation, are roughly average over the last 50 years. they're not that high. And I know I'm not trying to belittle the challenge for people of modest means of buying gasoline, but the fact is that they are, in a reasonable place. Food prices, grocery store prices have gone down for the last 4 months. But I don't think anybody who buys groceries would believe that or know that or feel that. I mentioned housing as a big challenge for a lot of Americans, whether they're first-time home buyers or people want to move and so on and so forth. The other thing that I think is going on out there that we do have to worry about is that wages, as I said, wages are going up a bit faster than inflation at the moment, but nothing like what we're historically used to. I mean, we're historically used to something like 2-3% real growth after inflation in wages, which comes out of productivity and things like that. Productivity growth has been really slow for a good while now. We can talk about that. That's a whole another. It is actually the most important part of this whole subject, but I won't dive into it until you're ready. But the fact is, productivity growth has been slow, which means that these real wage increases, the difference between inflation and what you get paid, are actually pretty small, and it doesn't make people feel better off. There is one other conundrum that I just want to throw out there and mention, which is that one of the effects of we've been running what economists would call running an economy hot. We had for a long time low interest rates. We had all these jobs. We had all this stuff going on, and a very low unemployment rate. And what that's actually done is it's actually been better for people at the bottom than at the top on a relative basis. I'm not in any way going to suggest they're as well off. But if you look at the change in the unemployment rate, wage increases, jobs, the people at the bottom actually have done a little bit better. Inequality has narrowed a little bit for the first time in a very long time. And that's obviously a good thing, even though it would be better if everybody's boats rose a little bit faster. So I think, I don't think there's, I get asked this question all the time, and everybody wants some silver bullet answer like, this is why people feel so bad even though the economy's pretty good. I just think it's really complicated. We should talk, and I won't take time now to do it, we should talk about AI, because it may worry people, but it is also, in my opinion, one of our single greatest hopes for the economy in the future.
Well, I do want to talk about two things. One, you mentioned productivity and the impact that is having on the productivity growth on business, and what, as business leaders, what you're seeing in terms of other parts, not just the consumer part of your business, but how that's impacting overall the business. How is that impacting how people are feeling, or how the sentiment is about the economy?
Yeah, I think, listen, I think there's a difference between what people see in the short term and what they see in the benefits over a period of time. And so, just efficiency, productivity is an example of when institutions like ourselves, like other companies out there, focus on productivity. The short-term feeling in that is we're able to do more with less. That is what it is. Mm-hmm. Doing with less mean spending less money on things. It could mean doing it with less people in the short term. And so the short-term impact of how that feels is it doesn't feel good to the people who are directly impacted by that. But then that gets replayed back into, okay, now how do we prepare a broader set of people to operate in a world which looks very different today than it does than it did 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the same thing's going to happen in the AI space. So, it is just, again, the recognition of it's the right thing for the long term is to become more efficient, to have more productivity, and to make sure that we're focusing on those that are impacted by this and what we're going to all do to make sure that they're not harmed by it.
Mm-hmm. What kind of real conversations, though, do you need to have with clients about this issue, as they are very concerned, as Steve mentioned, about what this is going to be doing to their livelihood?
Yeah. I want to put two things together here in answering your question, Sharon. There's another phenomenon going on right now that's been dubbed the Great Wealth Transfer. $84 trillion of wealth that is being moved from the two generations who own it, silent generation and baby boomers today, to the next 2 and even 3 generations. And in fact, some people of great wealth skipping the next generation and moving it on to generations beyond that. $84 trillion of wealth. This is a massive societal shift, because the desires and perspectives and points of view about the economy, about the prospects for society and the things that people want, the way that they want to live their lives. Our clients, we see this across the 4 and 5 generations of clients that we are working with at one time. The next 3 generations, the youngest 3 generations to get today, are talking about very different things than I talked about as a baby boomer, as I was thinking about building my family's nest egg. And so what's going to happen here is that as that wealth transfers, the way that people think about how to establish it, grow it, pass it on, and give it away, which is different, is going to shape the markets. It's going to shape not-for-profit organizations. It's going to shape our communities and our neighborhoods based on the points of view and perspectives of those who hold it today. And so what we work very hard to do is to not come to those conversations with judgment, but instead great curiosity about what is it that those 3 or 4 generations of family members are thinking about, what's important to them, what are their needs, wants, and wishes, and how do we help them establish a financial plan that takes their life plan and puts it into action. So this great wealth transfer that's going on right now that will have vast societal impacts. I'll give you just one data point. In 2020, women controlled $10 trillion of wealth. Within 10 more years, that will go to $40 trillion, 20 more years, that'll go to $40 trillion. 10 to 40 is a societal impact based on the needs and perspectives of women who are going to control that wealth. So now you get into the conversation about, well, what is it, what kind of work am I going to be doing, right? What sort of purposeful work am I going to be doing as a baby boomer who may or may not want to retire? As a parent of 30-year-old kids who are launching and forming practices and forming families. Now we have our first granddaughter. She's 10 weeks old. The moment I held her in my arms, it's like, well, I want to give her everything. And my financial advisor said, what if you have more grandchildren and it's all gone? That's not a really good idea. That's why I need a financial advisor, right? So the point is that things are shifting our perspective about how we work, where we live, what we want to support and do with our money, how we want to establish wealth. All of that is shifting right now, and it plays its way out in where people are living and working, how long they're going to work, and therefore what their financial plans need to reflect about their lives.
Yeah. Steve, what do people need to know about the reality of what AI will be able to do for them in their careers over the anxiety that they have of what it could be?
Can I just say one thing, Penny, and I will dig into that. Well, the first thing is that the 40 trillion of wealth among women is very interesting. I'm kind of sorry I'm happily married, but I am, so someone else will have that. But look, on housing, one of the things you remind me of when you said something that is interesting is this transfer of wealth has a lot of repercussions. So let me just give you one other example of it, which is that if you look at the amount of home equity that a typical baby boomer has today, a millennial has today, say a 35-year-old or something like that, it is substantially less than what a baby boomer had at the same point in his or her life. This is, again, one of the challenges we face. But what's even more interesting is if you dig inside that, you find that the inequality in terms of how much the spread between people who have a lot of home equity, people who have a little home equity, has gotten much, much wider. It's gotten much, much wider because the baby boomer parents, some of them are able to help their kids, some of them can't help their kids. And so you end up with this income inequality even in strange places, like who can afford some home equity to buy a new house. And so these are the things, I think, again, that make people feel uncomfortable. Look, AI does make people worry. I think the points that Charlie made about the importance of retraining and of getting people prepared for the jobs of the future as opposed to the jobs of the past is obviously going to be critical. Our transition from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, which has essentially gone on for a good while, was not managed well. We did not really figure out what to do with all these manufacturing workers who are not going to have jobs because of either a combination of automation or competition from China or Mexico or other places. And so you ended up with a lot of the famous white working class people in Ohio and places like that going from making $30 an hour in a manufacturing facility to making $15 an hour in a Starbucks. And that has created, I think, a lot of the social unrest that we have today. So we need to learn a lesson from that and do a much better job with the next transition. That said, I think AI is a critical component of the potential we have to re-accelerate growth and re-accelerate the growth in real incomes, just the way computers did in the 1990s and just the way it happened in manufacturing 100 years ago. We have to do that. There is no example that I'm aware of in human history where a technological innovation did not ultimately make people better off than they were before, did not ultimately create more jobs than there were before, did not ultimately spur growth. If you look at the whole continuum of human history, there was a tiny, tiny amount of growth for thousands and thousands of years until the 1700s and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And we take for granted now that kind of level of growth, but that is not the way the world has always worked. And unless we continue to innovate, and AI is probably the most exciting thing in front of us right now, we're not going to get our growth rate back to where it was. In fact, it could even continue to erode. And that would create even more unhappiness, even more social instability, and even more very undesirable outcomes.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, listen, the AI genie is out of the bottle. And so, we can debate about how fast it's going to go. But it is going to, it's going to, in our point of view, my point of view, it's going to bring far more change to how things are done, to what jobs look like, than any of the other changes that we've seen. It is just, and there's no question about that. And I think people should be incredibly excited by what that means in terms of what that potential is, what the benefits are going to be. But to Steve's point, when you think about what that is going to mean towards a group of people, a large group of people who have jobs today, and those jobs will be completely unnecessary in the future. Completely unnecessary. And if we aren't very conscious about thinking about what the world looks like today and what the world is going to look like in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and figure out how we're going to readjust learning, training, then the divide that's going to be created is going to be even greater than what we see today. And so again, I'm incredibly nervous about it, because I think we've got to be very, very clear and specific with what are we going to do to make sure we're not just getting all the advantages of it, but we're being very conscious about protecting against the negatives which could come out of this.
And what are you most concerned about in terms of the negatives that could
Well, I
come
think it's just that. Again, there are a huge number of jobs today that exist that aren't going to be necessary.
Yeah.
And they're not, and they're, some of them are jobs people who have higher degrees of education, right? And AI's been around for a long time, right? It's not that AI is new. It is the way that AI can be used in applications today. It's generative AI. It's creating something with AI that didn't exist before. And a lot of that was done by people. And so that is now going to be done for us. And yes, over a period of time, we'll still need a set of eyes to oversee it and whatnot, but it's going to continue to improve, continue to get better. And so all these jobs that created a bunch of things for people who are more educated and more skilled in their profession to actually use, that will be done for them. And so what are all of those people going to do? And in ways that are very much entry-level roles, which can be gateways to other things. Those gateway roles have to be redefined and changed. And that's going to be the interesting question of how are we all going to do that? How are we going to both apply things either within our own companies, but even more broadly as a society to make sure that we have people that are protected in ways that we didn't necessarily protect people as we've gone through these other changes that we've seen in our lifetime.
Yeah. Penny, how is that changing within the company, but also how are your advisors instructing people, advising people about how they can change their skills, upgrade their skills, so that they can continue to grow their money and be employable?
Right on. So now we're putting together the perspective of the investor and the perspective of the consumer as it relates to artificial intelligence and how it's going to affect us. So from the perspective of the investor, Steve, I'm right there with you. I think that this is a productivity unlock in our economy that we need, we want, and that we ought to benefit from in really, really responsible and thoughtful ways. And I think that the humility that you bring to business and policy making that says, you know, maybe we haven't managed or navigated these transitions as well as we should navigate this transition. I would ask all of you as business leaders, as consumers, to look to business, to look to government, to look for government agencies and hold us accountable to using these productivity unlocks in really powerful and responsible ways. So from the investor perspective, this is a growth and productivity unlock that's going to be really, really good for investment. From the consumer perspective then, our clients who are consumers and consumers of financial services want to be known. They want to be known deeply by us. They want us to, we say, get you, guide you, and make it easy. These productivity unlocks, like artificial intelligence and generative AI, help us to provide services to millions and millions of clients more efficiently and effectively so that we can actually keep the prices low so that we can serve more Americans, including people who are just beginning the process of establishing wealth, who might say, gosh, I can't afford financial advice. Well, in the way that the industry is constructed today, it is a little bit harder. But our company has committed for 100 years to supporting the middle class and to supporting people who want to become middle class and beyond that. And so productivity can be unlocked. AI can be used to be more efficient and effective in really, really responsible ways. And as I've heard very recently, we as consumers today expect those that we buy from to know us. There will never be a time going forward that we will be satisfied when who we're buying from or what we're buying doesn't already know something about us. We've already crossed that bridge. And so AI can help us do this responsibly, but more efficiently and effectively. Just as an example, we're applying it in our business. We have 8 million clients. We're going to double the number of clients that we care for and the number of assets of theirs that we've helped them build. And when you're talking about tens of millions of clients, and today 20,000 financial advisors, the insight that can be gained from knowing the pulse of North American consumers and investors, applying computing power to know individuals and groups of people even more thoughtfully and carefully more quickly, that helps us keep our prices low and helps us serve more people better.
Is this an opportunity, not just AI, but looking at these issues of closing some of these gaps that have existed between women and men in investing, between racial groups in terms of investing? I'm curious, as leading Edward Jones, the first woman to be the managing partner, in an industry that is so heavily male-dominated, very, very few blacks, Latinos as financial advisors, only a quarter of women are financial advisors in that industry. How are you changing that landscape and closing those gaps to reach more people?
Well, I'm really glad that you've asked that, because you're getting to something that all three of us have, which is the acknowledgement that there is differential spread of opportunity and wealth in our economy, and that's not good for our economy. When we think about consumer sentiment, that people are concerned about their jobs and concerned about their ability to upskill and reskill, that has an effect on the sentiment in our economy. So that wealth inequity sometimes in our industry comes from a point of view where people say, well, financial advice isn't for me. I don't see myself in that company or that group of financial advisors. I don't know if they would be willing to talk to me because I don't have much and I don't know much. We need more Americans to know that they deserve to have good financial advice. Whether they have very complex needs, they deserve to be well understood, and those who are just establishing wealth. And so very often it's the look of a place where you wonder if you're going to be accepted or recognized or seen there. And so our industry has typically been more white and more male. Our entire industry is working to change the face of that so that more people know that these are the places that they can go to for advice. Today, about 24% of the registered financial advisors in our industry are women. There are about 300,000 registered financial advisors in our industry. 24% women, 9% people of color. Our numbers are a little bit higher than that. We hired 1,000 new financial advisors so far this year, and 53% of them are women and people of color. At the same time, the success and retention rates of those financial advisors are the highest that they've ever been. And so we know that the desire for advice in the marketplace has gone up. The willingness to pay, frankly, for good advice has gone up. And so we need to be in a place where we are able to accommodate those needs and be a place where people know that they belong.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add
Yes,
something?
yes, please.
Just a very general thing, general statement, which is, if you go inside of corporate America today, I think in almost every management team meeting, every board conversation, the number one topic is, what are you doing in the AI space to change how you run your business and what you can do for your customers? Like, bar none. That is like the single biggest conversation that's being had. And it's going, and we're actually going to see the impacts of it in real time. Penny talked about what they're doing in Edward Jones to benefit consumer, but everyone's going to do it. And the reality of what people don't generally want to talk about is, because they want to talk about the positive things and all these whatnot, is the easiest places to go after are efficiency, right? About how you can do more with less. And so, like, over the next series of years, you're going to see companies that scale across the business environment find ways to do more with less because of AI. And ultimately, it'll allow them to serve customers more broadly. And so you know that impact is coming. And so then if you say, if like that is the number one conversation that's happening when the doors are closed, then you ask the question, well, what's the impact? What does that mean? That is going to mean that, again, there needs to be a rethink of what job structures look like, about what education looks like, about what training looks like. Because what's going to happen is those benefits that we're going to see, which we're going to see in terms of productivity, are going to create this, this wider divide, and then we're going to be sitting there saying, okay, now what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
And so the question, where when it comes to, school curriculums of all types, when you look in terms of training, in terms of what kind of programs should there be, whether it's in the private sector or in the public sector, to counteract the impact of what we're going to see.
Yeah.
And that's what I wish that there was more conversation about.
And conversations about how to bring into the fold those who have been left outside.
Or not
seen
before it happens. Like, we know
Yes.
that there are going to be changes in the types of people that we're going to want to hire, in the types of skills that we're going to need inside of companies of all sizes because of what technology is going to enable you to do. And how do we not just retrain that group of people, but prepare the next generation of people coming in so that they're prepared for what the world looks like, not what it used to look like.
Yeah. I'm particularly interested in how you're doing this now in light of a lot of the changes and the challenges that Wells Fargo in particular has faced over the years. I mean, you over the last 5 years have had to deal with billions of dollars in fines against Wells Fargo for customer abuses, whether that's mortgages or auto loans or overdraft lending, overdraft fees, and looking at marginalized communities as being some that may have been hurt the most.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, you've instituted several programs, whether it's for small businesses, whether it's for more inclusive banking, to include more people. When we're talking about these things in these discussions, AI being the cornerstone, how do you make sure that these other programs that you've put into
Sure.
place are going to grow and mature?
Yeah, listen, we want to serve a broad range of Americans in this country. And so, we serve, people that historically have not had access to banking institutions, all the way to those who have a significant amount of wealth. And we recognize that, for us to be perceived the way we want to be perceived broadly across this country, and more broadly, that we have to do all of that well. And so that means, from a business perspective, serving all those populations, and then using our philanthropy and the other means that we have, not as something on its own, but to accentuate what we can do in a business. And so one of the things that we've looked at and identified is when we think about why there is this large gap, the reality is that those that have access to education understand how to manage their financial affairs, how to treat things, their financial affairs differently. And so we have asked the question, just what can we do to have a broader impact? So one of the things that we've done is we've established, they're called Hope Inside Centers, partnered with John Hope Bryan and his organization. And it really is about providing education, not to our customers, but to the communities that we serve. Right? We have over 4,000 branches across the country. Many of them are in underserved communities. And we can provide an access point for people to engage in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to engage. And so, what we have found is that, we create one of these centers, generally over time by word of mouth, but we do our best to publicize it when we open these, is we want to attract people into the community that can come in, and we just have to help them with the basics. The basics are quite simple, which is improve your credit score, reduce your debt, and increase your savings. And what you find is that most people, for this population, you might not understand it, most people don't know how to do that. I mean, one of the great failings of our educational system is we don't teach people how to manage their financial affairs. We teach them about math and reading, we teach them about economics and history. Everyone has to manage their financial affairs, and the reality is those that are generally better off get access to that learning, and those that aren't don't, and they wind up suffering for it. And so providing the counseling for what impacts your credit score, what you can do to impact that credit score, the benefits of reducing debt. And what we have found is with the cohorts that we have coming into our branches, just through that counseling, roughly, when you look at it, we've been able to, for people that come in that engage with these counselors, 60% of the people increase their credit scores by 25 points in a relatively short period of time. Their debt levels go down by over $1,000, and their savings go up by $1,000.
Absolutely. Financial education encourages financial independence,
Absolutely.
and so it has to be everywhere.
Sharon, if I could just add on to that, Charlie, I mean, you see on stage the two financial services organizations who are trying to close these gaps. We made a commitment in 2020 to educate 1 million learners in high schools for basics of financial literacy and budgeting. We're at 900,000 learners. 33 states today mandate financial literacy curriculum in the high schools, but they don't pay for it. Right. We are pressing for a federal mandate for high school literacy education for every high school student, and we're going into high schools all over the country, paying for those tools with EverFi to help build this pipeline of better employees, of folks who got the financial basics so that they can have more control, more agency over their financial lives and financial well-being.
Absolutely. I want to open it now to questions from all of you. I know you have a lot of questions. The hands went up immediately in the back right there. If you could say your name and kind of the context of why you're asking your question.
Say my name. I'm Peter Brown. To what extent is this wonderful economy financed on a sugar high, financed by national debt that we'll be paying for decades to come? And if the economy is so great, why are we, as a government, borrowing so much money?
Well, look, that's a great question, and I'm glad we got into that in our remaining few minutes, because it's probably, actually, oddly enough, it is probably the biggest existential issue that in my opinion, that we face as a country, which is that we are on an unsustainable fiscal course. We are running deficits of close to $2 trillion a year. That is completely contrary to any economic theory of how you operate an economy. When you have unemployment at 4%, you don't run huge budget deficits. You save those for when you need to spend money to get the economy out of a recession, or as in the 1930s, out of a depression. And this is the fault, frankly, of both parties. We've had one party that has been very focused on cutting taxes in very major ways. I'm all for lower taxes, but they were not accompanied by any spending reductions. You have another party that spent a lot of money, but would not think about raising taxes. And we are in this terrible place where we now have $35 trillion plus or minus of national debt, and that is simply just going to keep going up. It is part of why the economy is, it is frankly part of why the economy is doing so well, but we can't afford it. It would be like a family going out and saying, well, I'm just going to go out and have a nice dinner and buy some new clothes and buy a new car, and I'm going to feel great. But then they have all this debt they have to deal with. I don't believe people worry. There are two concerns people have about the debt. One is that one of these days we're going to wake up and find out that the financial markets are not going to continue to buy $2 trillion a year of new treasuries. That is definitely a possibility. I don't think it's the likely outcome in my opinion. I think we are the ultimate borrower in the world, and people will always borrow, will always buy our debt, unlike many other countries. We are the reserve currency for the world. But it could happen, but it's not my base case. What definitely will happen, and there's not a debate about this, it's just a fact, is that as our society ages, which it is, as the need for healthcare, Medicare goes up, as the cost of Social Security goes up, as the interest costs on our debt go up, because part of why we've been able to sustain all this debt is interest costs were very low, 1 or 2%, close to zero for 15 years since the financial crisis. Those costs are going to go up. And what it's going to do is it's going to squeeze out all kinds of other spending. And Charlie talked a lot, and I agree with him, about, as did Penny, about the need for retraining and education and getting people adjusted to this new world. That money's going to have to come from somewhere. And if the federal budget is increasingly squeezed by all these other needs, and by the way, we do have to spend a lot of money on defense. I think we've all learned that in the last few years. That's going to be expensive for us. We are still the world's policemen in one form or another. And so this is the scary side of, I think, the relative optimism that we feel about a lot of this other stuff. And there does not seem to be any consensus or sense in Washington or anywhere that I can see about the need to address this. We just continue to do it. It's completely irresponsible, and it is, it is not an exaggeration to say that we are stealing from our children, our grandchildren, who are going to have to deal with the implications of all this. One last thing, and I meant to say before, if you don't mind, but I was reminded about it, that in terms of what's bothering people and what people have to think about, interest rates today are obviously a lot higher than they were. They're not high by long-term standards, and I think people have to get it out of their heads that interest rates are going to go back to zero at some point, that the Fed's going to start, as soon as inflation comes down, the Fed's going to start cutting rates a lot, and we're going to be back to where we were before all this. That's really, I don't think that is not going to happen. And part of that is, of course, because the federal government is borrowing so much. But basically, even if you think we get back to 2% inflation, and people who borrow money, who buy treasuries or borrow money, want some kind of real return on that interest, it points you to a 3-4% interest rate over the long term. So I think people have to wrap their minds around the fact that interest rates are not going back to zero, and that's going to be, I think, a shock when they realize that.
Absolutely. Another question there.
The potential job obsolescence resulting from AI. And I'm just curious, since that's the #1 topic in all your management meetings, what you are forecasting for the next 3 years in terms of actual job obsolescence and how you're going to retrain and reallocate your employees, or if you want to speak more generally about the banking industry in toto, how you're looking at that.
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, I think the banking industry is slightly different position than other companies because we're so highly regulated. And so what that means is we have to be, appropriately so, have to be really, really careful about what we implement, because it's on us, and our regulators will expect us to understand what the outcomes are before we do something. In many industries, you can learn along the way, you can do something, you can figure things out. If we do something that adversely impacts an individual, a company, or business, it's on us to have understood that before we would have put it in place. So we're having a lot of conversations and thinking through what these things look like, but the regulated banking industry, I think, will be much slower than other industries to actually put things out in the marketplace. But having said that, to the things that we are thinking about, we are very actively having the conversations about, okay, if we change something, what does that mean for these jobs? And again, my concern is around the things that we did. When someone showed up at Wells Fargo, went through a training program, the things that we would train you on to do a job, those things are not going to be the things we need to train you on anymore, because those things will be done for us. So how do we actually bridge that gap? Because by doing those things you learned, you're not going to have to be trained to do a series of things that you'll then learn from along the way. You have to go from here to there, and how are we going to create that? And the short answer is we're figuring it out along the way. It's still very early in the journey, though.
Yeah. One more question, right there.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Cheshire. I'm with the Financial Health Network, and I want to go back to the beginning of the conversation. I was so glad to hear you say, Charlie, that averages can be deceiving. I completely agree. We have all of these macroeconomic measures as a government, as a country, that are supposedly tell us how we're doing as a nation, but they obviously don't really help us understand different groups of people and how they're faring. So I'm curious, what else can we be measuring that incorporates more microeconomics so we can really understand the difference that companies like yours are making, and how you'll know when you're successful, so that when you're doing your quarterly earnings report, you're not just talking about the averages or the earnings per share that you're hoping to achieve, but that you can actually show that the products and services you're offering are actually making a difference, not just for the wealthiest of your customers, but for all of them. So how do you measure, how do you know that you're succeeding with your customers?
Yeah, so I'll answer it two different ways. Number one is, so internally, when we look at all of our different business metrics, again, we don't look at things like the averages, right? We look at, so within our consumer bank, we look at how, we take apart the business based upon a proxy for wealth levels, right? Sometimes we look at credit scores, sometimes we look at average size of deposit balances with us, sometimes we have deposits plus investments to say, how are we doing at serving those different populations? And what do we have to do to serve each of them equally well? And so in our case, what we have come to understand is that just like anything else, what they need is very, very different. The way we serve them is very, very different. We got to look at coverage models. We have to look at our product set. We have to look at pricing and ask the question in each of these segments, do we have the right holistic set of things so that we can drive increases in customers and more prosperity for that population? So internally, business by business, operating at that level of detail is the way we try and drive the conversation. As a company more broadly, the reality is a lot of it is going to come down to our reputation and how we're viewed. When I said before, there are more people, that are struggling than are doing well when you get through the averages. And the question about how are we doing at helping that cohort of individuals or businesses improve their lives will determine whether or not they view us as being a helpful partner in that. And so again, whether we do that directly by doing a better job serving them, by not making mistakes like we've made in the past, by using our philanthropic resources. We give away $300 million a year as a company. We're one of the largest foundations in the world. It's a gigantic number. And the question is, are we doing it in a way which is actually having an impact on the communities in which we serve? And ultimately, we're going to see that in how we're viewed as an institution. And we look at that, and sometimes, when we don't feel better, if it's not good, we ask the question why, and that then has an impact on what we do as a company.
Absolutely. What you do and your view and the view of consumers and investors about your company and your company is definitely part of what we're talking about in terms of trying to bridge this disconnect that we're seeing in terms of economic data and the feelings about the economy. Steve, Penny, Charlie, thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you all.
Great.